I still remember that night as if it were etched into my skin. The chandeliers glowed above, casting golden light across the grand hall. The music was soft, elegant, and expensive. People moved about in polished shoes and shimmering dresses, clinking glasses, laughing a little too loudly. It wasn't just any night. It was his night, my brother's celebration, his moment of glory. Harvard. The name itself carried a weight that seemed to crush me. The university that everyone in my family worshipped like a holy shrine. My brother was the golden son, the pride, the shining example, and me, I was just the extra, the one they forgot to mention when they bragged about their perfect family. That night I wasn't supposed to matter. I could feel it in every glance that slid past me, in every smile that never reached my direction. People looked at me as if I was just filling space, like a placeholder in the background of someone else's story. Even my parents were too busy beaming at him, standing a little taller than usual, their eyes glowing with pride. But what they didn't know, what nobody knew, was that I held something in my hand that would change everything. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't even fancy. Just a plain, sealed envelope, tucked carefully inside my jacket pocket. But sometimes the simplest things hold the greatest power. I remember touching it with my fingers, feeling the paper bend slightly as I clenched it tighter. It was the kind of envelope that could shift the ground beneath someone's feet. The kind of truth that could silence a whole room in an instant. And that room, full of polished laughter and hollow congratulations, was about to find out. From the very start, I knew my role at the party. I wasn't the reason for the music or the champagne. I wasn't the reason for the toasts and the applause. I was there as a shadow, the forgotten sibling, the one who didn't make the family Christmas cards look brighter. "Don't draw attention tonight," my mother had whispered before we walked in. Her voice was smooth, but it cut sharper than glass. "This is your brother's moment. Don't ruin it. Ruin it!" I laughed inside, but no sound came out. How could I possibly ruin something I was never even part of? But deep down, I knew things weren't going to end the way she thought. There are betrayals that slice you open with obvious cruelty, lies, broken promises, stolen chances. And then there are quieter betrayals, the kind where no one says your name, the kind where you're in the room but you might as well not exist. That was my betrayal. As my brother raised his glass, speaking about dreams and futures, my name was never mentioned. As family friends told stories of his brilliance, my existence blurred into silence. Even my parents. Their pride was so thick I wondered if they remembered they had more than one child. I smiled when expected. I nodded when spoken to. But inside, a storm raged. Because they didn't know, none of them knew. That envelope in my pocket, it was the quiet storm. I could have opened it right away. I could have stood up in the middle of his speech, raised my voice, and let the truth spill out across the polished floors. But no, that wasn't the right moment. Revenge, or maybe justice, works best when it waits, when it lingers in silence until the perfect second. So I waited, and while I waited, I let the tension build. I let the laughter sting, the whispers cut, and the glances burn. Every insult, every act of dismissal, it only sharpened the edge of what I was about to reveal. Because here's the thing about being ignored. When nobody expects anything from you, your silence becomes your power. Even now, when I replay the night in my mind, I see it like a movie. The colors were brighter, the sounds sharper, and the emotions heavier. The glasses of champagne were lined up on silver trays. The polished shoes reflected the light. The air was filled with the hum of people congratulating, clapping, and admiring. And me, sitting quietly at the corner of the hall, one hand resting on the envelope, the other clenched around the edge of my chair. Nobody noticed me. Nobody cared. And yet, I held the one thing that could unravel the night. At one point, my brother caught my eye across the room. His smile was wide, practiced, and confident. The kind of smile that says, "I've won, you've lost. That's just how it is." If only he knew. I didn't smile back. I simply slipped my hand into my jacket pocket and brushed the edge of the envelope. The paper crinkled faintly under my fingers, a whisper of what was to come. He didn't know it yet. Nobody did. But the night they thought belonged to him was about to shift. And I, the one they ignored, dismissed, and overlooked, was about to matter more than I ever had before. They say every family has a favorite. Some deny it, of course. Parents insist they love all their children equally, that every child is special in their own way. But let me tell you something. You can feel it. You can feel it in the smallest details. Who gets the bigger slice of cake, whose achievements are framed on the wall, whose failures are forgiven, and whose mistakes are never forgotten. In my family, there was never any doubt. My brother was the golden child, and me, I was the shadow. Growing up in his glow, from the time we were kids, everything revolved around him. When he brought home a drawing from school, it was a masterpiece, destined for the fridge door where guests could admire it. When I brought home a drawing, it ended up tucked under a pile of unopened mail, as if the colors I spilt onto paper were invisible. When he got a perfect score on a math test, there was a celebration, ice cream, and laughter. When I struggled, the room grew heavy with sighs and disappointment. I was measured against him in every way, and I always came up short. He was the athlete, the scholar, the prodigy. I was the other one, the forgotten one. I can't count how many times I heard the same phrases. Your brother is such a genius. Your brother is destined for great things. Your brother is going places. Notice the pattern? Always him. At family gatherings, people would crowd around him, asking about his classes, his plans, and his goals. They would lean in close, eyes sparkling with admiration. Then, when it came to me, their questions would stumble. A forced smile, a polite nod, and a quick change of subject. It wasn't just strangers. It was my parents, too. My father's voice would grow warm when he spoke about my brother, carrying pride like a medal pinned to his chest. But when it came to me, his voice grew colder, clipped, almost embarrassed. "Why can't you be more like him?" he'd ask, as if I hadn't already spent my entire life drowning in his shadow. Resentment doesn't bloom overnight. It's planted, watered, and nurtured, sometimes unintentionally, sometimes carelessly. For me, it started small. The forgotten birthdays, the missed recitals, and the way my parents' eyes always drifted to him, even when I was the one speaking. But as the years passed, those small moments built walls inside me. Walls made of silence, frustration, and loneliness. I wanted to hate him. Truly, I did. But how do you hate someone who never asked to be the favorite? The truth is, my brother didn't create the pedestal he stood on. My parents did. The world around us did. And maybe, in some cruel way, I did too, by never being enough in their eyes. It didn't matter what I achieved. It was never the same. When I got into a decent college, my parents congratulated me politely, then immediately reminded me of how much harder my brother's school had been to get into. When I landed an internship, they smiled briefly, then told me about my brother's groundbreaking research project. Every step I took was measured against his leaps. Every accomplishment of mine was reduced to a footnote beneath his headline. And over time, I started to believe it. I started to believe that maybe I wasn't meant for greatness. Maybe my role was simply to watch him shine while I faded quietly into the background. People assume being the overlooked sibling means you're bitter, jealous, and angry all the time. But the truth is, it's lonelier than that. I didn't walk around scowling at him. I didn't plot ways to sabotage his success. On the outside, I smiled. I clapped. I played the role of the supportive sibling, but inside, it tore me apart. Every time I saw my parents' eyes light up for him, a piece of me dimmed. Every time I heard another person compare me unfavorably, my confidence crumbled a little more. Do you know what it feels like to sit in a room full of people who act as if your existence is optional? To hear your name only when it's attached to a reminder of what you aren't? That was my life, and the resentment grew, quietly, patiently, like a seed buried deep in the soil, waiting for the right moment to break through. That's why, when I talk about the envelope, you need to understand something. It wasn't just paper. It wasn't just words written in ink. It was validation, proof, a chance to step out of the shadows and stand in the light, even if just for a moment. It was everything I had ever been denied: respect, recognition, worth. And maybe, just maybe, it was revenge. Not the cruel kind, not the kind meant to destroy, but the sweet kind. The kind that forces people to stop, to look, to finally see you for who you are. And as I sat there in that grand hall surrounded by laughter that wasn't meant for me, I knew tonight wasn't just his night. It was mine too. Here's the thing about being overlooked. It sharpens you. It teaches you to notice the details others miss. It makes you resilient in ways the golden child will never understand. My brother had always been handed the spotlight. He never had to fight for it. But me? I had learned to live in the dark, to carve my identity in silence. And that silence became my strength, because while they were busy praising him, I was building something of my own, something none of them saw coming. And when the moment arrived, when that envelope finally opened, the golden child and the forgotten one would no longer stand on opposite ends of the scale. For the first time, the world would see us as equals, or maybe, just maybe, they'd see me rise above. And that's the cruel irony of being the forgotten one. We remember. We remember every slight, every insult, every invisible moment. And one day, when the timing is right, we make sure they remember us too. The hall glittered that night, but none of the light belonged to me. Every crystal glass sparkled for him. Every note of music was chosen for him. Every congratulatory word floated toward him like confetti falling from the ceiling. It was supposed to be a family celebration, but the truth was clear the moment I stepped inside. This wasn't our night. It was his Harvard acceptance, his triumph, his pedestal. And I was just the extra seat at the table. The moment we walked in, I felt it. Eyes drifted past me like I was invisible, like I hadn't even entered the room. I trailed a few steps behind my parents, my presence barely acknowledged. People rushed up to greet them, hands extended, voices full of excitement. Congratulations! You must be so proud of him. What an incredible achievement. He's destined for greatness just like you always said. Not once did anyone look at me. Not once did anyone ask how I was doing or even bother to say my name. I may as well have been a shadow stretching across the floor. My brother stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by admirers. His suit was perfectly tailored, his hair neat, and his smile shining with effortless confidence. He held court as if he were royalty, and the guests, they were his loyal subjects. He thrived in that spotlight. He always had. I watched as people leaned in, hanging on his every word. They laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny. They nodded at his plans for the future, as if every sentence he spoke carried the weight of prophecy. And there I was, off to the side, nursing a glass of water because no waiter bothered to offer me champagne. This was his world. And in his world, I didn't exist. The worst betrayals aren't always loud. Sometimes they're subtle. A sideways glance, a whispered remark, a laugh that wasn't meant for you but cuts you all the same. That night was full of them. I overheard two distant relatives whispering near the buffet table. At least one of their kids turned out well. The other chuckled. Yeah, thank God for him. Imagine if they only had the other one. The other one, that was me. That was how they referred to me. Not by name, not even by face, but as an afterthought. Another guest, a family friend, spotted me standing alone. For a brief second, I thought she might actually strike up a conversation. Instead, she smiled awkwardly and said, "You must be so proud of your brother." Then she drifted away, as if that one sentence was enough to cover her obligation to acknowledge me at all. Each small slight stacked up inside me, brick by brick, building a wall of resentment that grew higher by the minute. I searched my parents' faces, hoping maybe, just maybe, they would notice. That they would see me standing alone, silent, forgotten. But their eyes never once met mine. My father stood tall, chest puffed out with pride, bragging about my brother's future at Harvard. My mother's hand clutched his arm as she glowed with the kind of joy I had never seen her show for me. Every laugh and every compliment they received from others was absorbed like fuel. Their pride in him was endless, and their indifference to me was just as deep. I wasn't their disappointment that night. I wasn't even their embarrassment. I was simply nothing. Later in the evening, I found myself near a small group of cousins. They were around my age, but we'd never been close. Tonight, they seemed especially entertained at my expense. One of them smirked as he glanced at me. "So, what are you up to these days?" His tone was casual, but the mockery behind it was sharp. Before I could answer, another cousin chimed in, grinning, probably still trying to figure it out. Not everyone can get into Harvard, right? The group laughed. Not cruelly loud, but just enough to let me know the joke had landed. I forced a smile, but inside my chest burned. They had no idea what I held in my pocket. No idea that the envelope tucked against my jacket was worth more than all their smirks combined. But still, it hurt. I drifted through the room like a ghost, unseen and unheard. People brushed past me without apology, as if I were part of the decor, something to step around but not acknowledge. The celebration carried on in waves of laughter and applause. Toasts were made, glasses clinked, stories shared, all of them orbiting around him, the golden star of the evening. And me? I was the planet left in the dark, circling his glow, never noticed for my own light. I slipped my hand into my jacket pocket, fingers brushing the envelope again. Its edges felt sharp now, like a weapon, like a secret blade no one else knew existed. Every insult, every laugh, every ignored moment only made it heavier. Not in weight, but in meaning. It wasn't just paper anymore. It was my chance to change the script, to flip the story they had already written about me. I thought about pulling it out right then, in the middle of the chatter and laughter, and tearing it open for all to see. But no, not yet. Timing was everything, and I had waited too long and endured too much to waste this moment on anything less than perfect. By the time the speeches began, my patience was stretched thin. My brother stood at the front of the room, soaking in the spotlight like it was made just for him. He thanked our parents, his teachers, and his mentors. He spoke of hard work, of sacrifice, of dreams becoming reality. The room erupted in applause, cheers bouncing off the walls. My parents' eyes shimmered with tears. People rose to their feet in a standing ovation. I clapped too, not because I wanted to, but because anything else would have exposed the storm raging inside me. Because here's the truth. That night, I wasn't just ignored, I was erased, and the only thing keeping me from shattering completely was the envelope pressed tightly against my chest, the envelope that promised everything was about to change. If the party had only been about ignoring me, maybe I could have endured it. I'd gotten used to being invisible. Silence was familiar. The absence of acknowledgement was almost expected. But that night, it wasn't enough for them to forget me. They had to talk about me too, not with kindness, not with sympathy, but with whispers that cut sharper than any knife. It started near the dessert table. I stood in line for a slice of cake, waiting as the server carefully arranged perfect squares of chocolate mousse on golden plates. That's when I heard it. Two voices behind me, low but clear enough to sting. I heard the younger one didn't even finish the program he started. A pause, then a chuckle. Figures. Not everyone can keep up. At least his brother carries the family name well. They didn't know I was standing right there. Or maybe they did and they just didn't care. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. The plate trembled slightly in my hand. I wanted to spin around, to shout that they didn't know the truth, that they didn't know me. But I stayed silent, swallowing the anger like I had my whole life. Later, I found myself near my parents. They were surrounded by a small crowd, glowing in the aftermath of my brother's speech. Someone asked politely about me, about what I'd been doing lately. For a moment, I held my breath. A foolish, hopeful part of me thought my parents might say something kind. Maybe they would mention my work, my efforts, anything at all. But my father only waved his hand dismissively. Oh, he's still figuring things out. Not everyone's cut out for the Ivy League, you know? Laughter rippled through the group. Not cruel laughter, but the kind that twists around your ribs all the same. My mother chimed in, her tone light, almost apologetic. He'll find his way eventually. Every family has different strengths. Different strengths. I wanted to scream, because it wasn't about different strengths. It was about hierarchy, about who mattered and who didn't, about whose story was worth telling, and whose was brushed aside like clutter in a corner. And in that moment I realized something brutal. My own parents believed the whispers too. I tried to escape into the quieter corners of the room, but whispers follow shadows. Near the balcony doors, I caught my cousins again. They were laughing, the kind of laughter that spreads like wildfire when it's at someone else's expense. Imagine being in his shoes, one of them said. Your brother gets into Harvard and you, what, still live at home? Maybe he'll get an honorary title someday. Another chimed in. World's best +1. They all burst out laughing. I turned away quickly, pretending I hadn't heard, but the words burrowed deep. They stuck to me, heavy and suffocating. Because here's the truth. They weren't just mocking me. They were mocking my very existence. I went to the restroom just to breathe, to escape the noise that had turned into knives. Staring at myself in the mirror, I barely recognized the face looking back. My eyes were glassy, my jaw clenched, and my shoulders tight with every word I had swallowed that night. I wanted to vanish. I wanted to walk out the door and never return. But then, I slipped my hand into my jacket pocket, and I felt it again. The envelope. Smooth, solid, waiting. It pulsed in my hand like a heartbeat, reminding me that I wasn't as powerless as they thought, that I had something no one in that room expected, something that could turn every whisper into silence. and for the first time that night a spark lit inside me. When I walked back into the hall, I didn't head toward the crowd. I stayed in the shadows, watching, listening. The whispers hadn't stopped. A group of family friends glanced in my direction, shaking their heads. Such a shame he never lived up to the same standard. Well, not everyone's born for greatness. Every word tightened the coil inside me. But I didn't lash out. Not yet, because anger burns fast. But silence? Silence holds power. I let them speak. I let them dismiss. I let them build their narrative of me, brick by brick, so that when the truth finally dropped, the sound of those bricks shattering would echo louder than anything I could ever say. That was the night I understood something. Betrayal doesn't always come from enemies. Sometimes it comes from the people who are supposed to protect you. It comes from parents who shrug at your achievements, from relatives who use your name as a punchline, and from whispers that reduce you to less than you are. And that night, surrounded by gold and laughter and endless praise for my brother, I felt the weight of every betrayal pressing down on me. But beneath it all, beneath the hurt and humiliation, there was also resolve, because they had made one mistake. They had forgotten that silence can be broken, and when it breaks loudly. As the evening stretched on, I stayed close to the edges of the celebration, silent but no longer defeated. I wasn't just enduring anymore, I was waiting. Every laugh at my expense, every whispered dismissal, every mocking glance only sharpened my determination. They thought they had already written the story, the golden child and the forgotten one. But they hadn't seen the final page, and in my pocket, that page waited, folded, sealed, and ready to change everything. I knew then, with a clarity I had never felt before. This was not my brother's night. This was not my parents' night. This was not my cousin's night. This night would belong to me. They just didn't know it yet. The envelope wasn't meant to be noticed. It wasn't shiny or elegant, nothing like the embossed invitations that had brought everyone to the Harvard celebration. Just a plain white envelope, sealed, silent, tucked deep in the inside pocket of my jacket. But to me, it was heavier than gold because hidden inside that thin paper sleeve was the truth, and truth has a way of cutting deeper than any whisper ever could. I don't know how many times I touched it that night. Maybe 10, maybe 20. Every time someone laughed at me, every time a relative compared me to my brother, my hand slipped instinctively into my pocket. My fingers traced the envelope's edge like a talisman. The more they dismissed me, the heavier it felt. Not heavy in weight, heavy in meaning. That envelope wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a storm, waiting. A secret so sharp it could split the night in two. And the beautiful thing about secrets, no one sees them coming. The irony of it all, while everyone in that hall obsessed over my brother's Harvard acceptance letter, none of them realized that I, too, carried a letter that could rewrite everything. They were so blinded by his spotlight they couldn't imagine I had a light of my own. And so I moved through the room quietly, invisible, the envelope pressed against my chest. Nobody asked about it. Nobody wondered why I kept one hand close to my jacket. Nobody even looked at me long enough to notice. That's the curse of being the forgotten one. But sometimes it's also the blessing, because the less they see you, the less they expect. And the less they expect, the greater the shock when the truth is finally revealed. At one point, I drifted close to a group of relatives still buzzing about my brother's future. Harvard, one said, his voice dripping with awe. It doesn't get bigger than that. He's destined for success. Another chimed in. That family's so lucky. At least one of their kids is a real star. They laughed, and I smiled faintly, not at their joke but at my secret. If only they knew. If only they knew that in my pocket was a letter they would never expect. A letter that could change the tone of every conversation in that hall. A letter that could silence their laughter and replace it with stunned, breathless silence. The whispers were fuel, and the envelope was the match. But holding a secret is complicated because along with the power comes fear. What if I opened it too soon? What if I chose the wrong moment, and my revelation was lost in the noise of the night? Timing mattered. Revenge, or justice, or whatever this was, needed patience. A single misstep and it would fall flat, forgotten as quickly as it appeared. So I waited. I let the envelope rest against my heart, beating in time with my pulse, reminding me of what was coming. Reminding me to hold on, to endure, to let the moment build until it could no longer be ignored. My brother noticed me once, just once. Our eyes met across the hall. His glass of champagne shimmered in his hand, his smile wide and effortless. It was the kind of smile that said, "I've won. I always win. You'll never catch up." I didn't smile back. Instead, I slid my hand into my pocket, pressing my fingers firmly against the envelope, letting him see the smallest flicker of movement. He raised an eyebrow, confused for a second, but then someone tapped his shoulder, pulling him back into the circle of admirers, and he forgot about me. That's when I realized something. He had no idea, not him, not my parents. Not a single person in that room suspected the truth. And when it finally came out, the shock would be blinding. As the night wore on, the laughter and applause only grew louder. Toast after toast was raised in his honor, stories spilt about his brilliance, and the praise flowed endlessly. I stayed silent, not because I had nothing to say, but because my silence was deliberate now. Every word I held back added weight to the envelope. Every insult I swallowed made the secret stronger. I wasn't just the forgotten sibling anymore. I was the one holding the fuse. And when the moment came, I wasn't going to whisper. I was going to let the envelope speak for me. Here's the truth they couldn't see. That envelope carried news of my own. News that didn't just place me on equal ground with my brother, it might even lift me above him. But I didn't need to shout it. I didn't need to fight for their attention. Because the beauty of truth is that it doesn't beg to be seen. It demands it. And when the seal finally broke, when those folded words inside came to light, no amount of champagne or applause could drown them out. The more the night went on, the clearer it became to me. This wasn't just about a letter. It was about justice, about balance, about finally stepping out of the shadow I had been forced into my whole life. The envelope wasn't just my weapon. It was my freedom. And the longer I waited, the more suspense tightened its grip around me. Every laugh in that room, every toast, every dismissal, it all led to one inevitable moment. The moment when paper would speak louder than voices. The moment when the golden child and the forgotten one would finally stand side by side. And for once, the world would see me. The music faded into the background. I don't know if the band actually stopped playing or if my own heartbeat drowned it out, but suddenly the whole celebration hall felt unnaturally still. Glasses clinked and laughter rang across the room, but inside me there was only one sound, the crinkle of paper as my fingers slid into my pocket. For hours I had waited. For hours I had listened to the whispers, endured the smirks, and swallowed every bitter taste of being forgotten. But the moment had come. The envelope was in my hand, and for the first time that night I felt taller. It started with a toast. My uncle had just raised his glass yet again, praising my brother's brilliance, his future, and his destiny. He ended with a dramatic flourish, "To the pride of this family." "To Harvard!" Applause thundered. Cheers erupted. The spotlight shone directly on my brother's smiling face. And that's when I did it. I cleared my throat, just once, quiet, almost delicate. At first, no one noticed, but then I stepped forward, the envelope visible now, its white surface glowing faintly in the lights of the hall. My hand trembled slightly, but my voice, when it finally came, was steady. "I have something," I said. The room hushed slowly, like ripples calming on water. Dozens of eyes turned, confused, impatient, and some even annoyed. My parents exchanged puzzled looks. My brother's smirk froze on his face. "What's that?" someone muttered. I held the envelope higher. "This," I said, "is my story." The silence was almost unbearable. With every second that passed, the tension grew tighter, pulling every gaze toward me, toward the simple paper in my hand. I tore it open. The rip of the seal echoed louder than the band's instruments. Inside, folded neatly, was a single letter. Not thick with extra pages, not embellished with gold, just one piece of paper. But when I unfolded it, when I revealed the words printed inside, the air in that room shifted because the crest at the top was unmistakable, and the words beneath it were undeniable. "Congratulations." My voice didn't waver. I read aloud, slowly, clearly, letting every syllable sink into the stunned silence around me. "Congratulations. We are pleased to inform you of your full acceptance." Gasps. Actual gasps. The kind you only hear in theaters when the plot twists so hard the audience can't believe it. I looked up. Dozens of wide eyes stared back at me, darting from the letter to my face, then back again. And then, with deliberate care, I read the final line. "Welcome to Yale University." For a moment, the room didn't move. No laughter, no applause, no whispers, just silence. It was as if the very walls had leaned in closer, straining to absorb the truth. My brother's Harvard celebration had been designed to crown him king, yet here I stood holding a crown of my own. Not second place, not a consolation prize, but Yale, equally prestigious, equally untouchable. And suddenly their golden child didn't shine so alone. The silence broke in uneven waves. Yale, someone whispered, barely audible. Another voice gasped, full acceptance? And then, louder, clearer, he got in too. The crowd erupted, not in cheers this time, but in chaos. Conversations overlapped, heads turned, and eyes darted. Shock ricocheted from face to face. My aunt dropped her glass, shattering champagne across the marble floor. My cousin's jaw literally hung open. And my parents stared at me as if they were seeing me for the very first time, but nothing compared to my brother. His smile had vanished completely. His champagne glass, still in his hand, lowered slowly, almost mechanically, until it hovered forgotten near his side. His eyes, once full of effortless pride, now flickered with disbelief, then confusion, then something else, something darker. Because in that moment, he realized the truth. The spotlight wasn't his alone anymore. For years, he had been the chosen one, the center, the golden child. But with one piece of paper, I had shifted the balance. His crown wasn't shattered, but it was no longer untouchable, and he hated it. "Why didn't you tell us?" My mother finally breathed. Her voice wasn't angry. It wasn't proud either. It was shaken, unsteady, like she couldn't quite comprehend the reality before her. My father blinked rapidly, as if trying to process numbers that didn't add up. "You, Yale?" he whispered. "You?" I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. "Yes," I said simply. "Me." It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a victory shouted from the rooftops. It was quieter, sharper, and more powerful because the truth didn't need fireworks. The truth spoke for itself. And as I stood there, letter in hand, surrounded by stunned silence and broken whispers, I realized something. This was better than revenge. This was justice. The applause that had filled the hall for my brother minutes earlier now felt hollow, almost forced. The attention had shifted, undeniably, irreversibly. Guests who had ignored me earlier now leaned closer, asking questions, trying to understand. Relatives who had mocked me moments before now struggled to piece together how they'd missed it. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to, because the envelope had spoken, and its voice was louder than all of theirs combined. I glanced once more at my brother. His jaw was tight, his fists clenched, but he said nothing. His silence was louder than any protest. For the first time in our lives, he had no words. And I? For the first time in my life, I didn't need any. The letter in my hand said it all. The letter trembled softly in my hand, though not from fear anymore. No. The trembling came from release, from the flood of emotions I had held in for so long finally pouring out, quiet but unstoppable. For years I had lived in my brother's shadow, unseen and uncelebrated. Tonight that shadow cracked, and the most beautiful part? I didn't have to scream or argue or demand respect. The truth had done the work for me. A room rewritten. The Harvard celebration was no longer just his. Everywhere I turned, I caught eyes that once overlooked me now struggling to meet mine. The same relatives who laughed at me earlier suddenly softened their tones. The same cousins who whispered behind my back now leaned forward, hungry for a piece of my story. "Why didn't you say anything?" one asked. "That's incredible," another stammered. "Yale, full acceptance. I mean, wow." Their voices no longer dripped with dismissal. Now they clung with a desperate sort of curiosity, like people realizing they had misjudged the ending of a story. And I let them. I let their questions hang in the air, unanswered. Because the truth wasn't theirs to dissect. Not anymore. My brother's crumbling throne, but the sweetest part was my brother. He stood frozen, watching the shift unfold like someone watching their castle crumble brick by brick. All evening, he had basked in admiration, surrounded by people who treated him like royalty. Now, those same people peeled away, turning their attention toward me. It wasn't that they stopped respecting him. Harvard was still Harvard, but their certainty, their unshakable belief that he was the only star, was gone. He knew it. I knew it. And the silence between us carried more weight than words ever could. The parents. My parents didn't know what to do. They hovered close, torn between pride and guilt. My mother's hands fidgeted with the hem of her dress, her eyes flickering between me and my brother, unsure where to rest. My father, usually so firm and authoritative, could only manage half-smiles that never quite reached his eyes. "You should have told us," he said finally. We would have celebrated you too." Would have. Those two words hung heavy, more cutting than he realized, because the truth was, they hadn't celebrated me. They hadn't asked. They hadn't believed I could have a story worth celebrating. Now, forced into the light of my success, they scrambled to rewrite their neglect into support. But respect given too late feels less like love and more like obligation. The sweetest revenge, and that, right there, was my revenge. Not anger, not shouting, not rubbing my success in their faces, just standing tall, letter in hand, watching them stumble over their apologies, their excuses, their sudden attempts at pride, because nothing I could have said or done would ever compare to this moment. The silence that followed my announcement was louder than any confrontation. The shock on their faces was sharper than any insult I could have crafted. The truth had spoken, and they couldn't ignore it anymore. Questions with edges as the room buzzed. Relatives swarmed me with questions. What program did you get into? Do you know when you're leaving? How did you manage it without telling anyone? Each question carried an edge, half genuine curiosity, half desperate attempt to cover their earlier dismissal. And though I answered politely, I didn't give them everything, because for once I didn't owe them explanations. They had written me off as a failure. They had laughed in corners, whispered at dinner tables, and compared me to my brother without hesitation. And now they wanted details? No, let them wonder. Let their curiosity sting. That was my quiet payback. The brother's eyes, my brother finally spoke. "Why didn't you say anything earlier?" he asked, his voice low, tight. I met his eyes. For the first time in years, I didn't look down, because I didn't need to. I said simply, and that was it. That was the dagger. Because for him, everything was about being seen, being celebrated, and being applauded. But for me, it was about truth. And truth didn't beg for attention. Truth simply existed. His jaw clenched. His knuckles whitened around his champagne glass. But he had no retort, no insult, no laughter left. And in that silence, I won. The room. Tilt's eye noticed something then. Something almost poetic. The decorations, the banners, the champagne, the cake, all of it was branded with Harvard red. A shrine to his achievement. Yet all of it now felt like a backdrop to my moment. Nobody cared about the color of the balloons or the sparkle of the cake. All they could think about was the letter in my hand, the words that had rewritten the night. The party wasn't mine, but the respect was, and that was enough. Too late. They celebrated me now. They clapped me on the back, they showered me with praise, and they told me how proud they were. But inside, I knew the truth. It was too late. Respect, when it's delayed, loses its sweetness. Pride, when it's forced, tastes hollow. Their words rolled off me like water on glass, because I remembered their silence, their dismissal, their whispers. And though they tried to cover it now, I would never forget it. Yes, they respected me tonight, but it wasn't born of faith. It wasn't born of love. It was born of shock, and shock fades. The power of silence. So I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't turn their cruelty back on them. Instead, I smiled. Calm, steady, unshaken. Because silence was my victory. Because patience was my revenge. Because success, spoken through the envelope, had already done everything I needed. A closing glance as the night wound on. The music picked up again. Conversations scattered, and the party limped forward. But nothing was the same. The balance had shifted, and everyone felt it. Before I left, I looked back once. My brother stood in the corner, no longer surrounded by admirers. My parents hovered awkwardly nearby, still trying to bridge a gap they had created long ago. And me? I walked out taller, the envelope still in my hand. Not because I wanted to wave it in their faces, but because I wanted to remember the weight of it. The weight of being underestimated, dismissed, forgotten, and the sweeter weight of proving them wrong. The hall wasn't loud anymore. Yes, the band still played faintly in the corner, and the chatter of small groups buzzed across the room. But there was a difference now. The noise no longer carried joy, no longer swelled with admiration. It carried tension. It carried unease. It carried silence in disguise. because beneath every whisper, beneath every glance, was the truth that no one could ignore anymore. The forgotten one had spoken, and the room would never see me the same way again. The still point, I stood in the center, letter still in my hand, and for a brief moment it felt like the entire celebration froze. The chandeliers above glimmered softly, the champagne flutes caught the light, and the decorations glowed Harvard red, but none of that mattered anymore. The spotlight had shifted. It was no longer his party. It was ours. And yet, in a way, it was mine. The brothers' silence across the room, my brother stood stiff, his smile gone, his posture tight. For so long, he had been the star. Every eye drawn to him, every compliment directed his way. But now, when people looked at him, their gazes carried something else. Not rejection, not yet, but doubt. He could feel it. I could see it in his clenched jaw, in the way his fingers tapped nervously against his glass, and in the tightness of his shoulders. He wasn't used to sharing the stage. He wasn't used to being questioned, and he certainly wasn't used to standing in my shadow. But in that moment, he did, and he knew it. The parents' stare, my parents' eyes burnt holes through me, not with anger, but with something far heavier, regret. All their years of dismissing me, all their sighs of disappointment, all their casual comparisons to my brother, they collapsed in on themselves in a single instant. Now they stared at me as if trying to make up for it, as if their silence tonight could erase a lifetime of silence before. But it couldn't. They knew it, and that was why their faces looked so hollow. The shift in the guests. The guests, too, had changed. Earlier they had barely glanced at me. Some had mocked, some had whispered, and most had ignored. But now their eyes darted back and forth, caught between my brother's Harvard letter and my Yale acceptance. It wasn't about which was better. Harvard and Yale, both titans, both symbols of achievement. The real shock was that I, the overlooked one, had stood in the shadows holding a crown of my own all along, and the shame was theirs for not seeing it sooner. Voice that carried. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to demand anything. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, but it carried through the room like a bell in a cathedral. All my life, I said quietly, I've been invisible in this family. Tonight, I wanted you to see me. No one breathed. No one interrupted. And now, I continued, holding the letter high, you do. The power of silence. The words weren't long. They weren't polished or rehearsed, but they didn't have to be, because what followed wasn't applause. It wasn't cheers. It wasn't the forced celebration my brother had basked in earlier. It was silence. A silence so heavy it felt holy. A silence that said more than noise ever could. In that silence, I wasn't forgotten. I wasn't overlooked. I wasn't less. I was undeniable. A brother. Humbled. My brother finally stepped forward, as if trying to reclaim some piece of his lost crown. He opened his mouth, but no words came. He looked around, hoping for support, but found only eyes flickering away. For the first time, he was humbled, and not because I had shouted him down, not because I had embarrassed him, but because the truth itself had leveled us. He and I now stood as equals, and in his silence, he admitted it. The long-awaited spotlight. I didn't ask for the spotlight, but tonight it found me. It wasn't harsh or blinding. It wasn't a burst of glory or a sudden wave of applause. It was steadier, warmer, like the quiet glow of a candle finally lit after years of being hidden in the dark. People saw me, truly saw me, not as the forgotten one, not as the failure, but as someone who had carved their own path, who had carried their own fire, who had earned their place in the light, and in that moment, I didn't need more, a moment to keep forever. As I stood there, I realized something profound. This silence, this stillness, wasn't just about me proving myself. It wasn't about outshining my brother or even winning my family's respect. It was about something far deeper, finally being at peace with who I was, no matter who had doubted me. The letter was proof. The silence was confirmation, and the feeling in my chest, the calm, unshakable certainty, was victory. The spotlight shifts. Forever. Eventually, the noise returned. The band played louder, the guests forced laughter, and the party stumbled back into motion. But it wasn't the same. The night had been rewritten, and though my brother tried to smile again, though my parents tried to carry on, though relatives tried to fill the silence with chatter, nothing could erase the shift that had taken place. I had stepped into the spotlight, and I wasn't leaving. The night was winding down. The champagne flutes stood half empty. The music played on as if nothing had happened, and the decorations still shouted Harvard Red. But for me, the celebration had already ended. Not because I lost, but because I had already won, and my victory wasn't in their applause, or their questions, or even their sudden attempts at pride. It was in my silence. It was in the envelope that had spoken louder than I ever could. It was in the way the room looked at me now, finally, undeniably, with respect, choosing grace. I could have stayed. I could have basked in it, soaked up the attention and demanded apologies. But that wasn't me. That wasn't the kind of revenge I wanted. No, what I wanted was to leave them with the silence, to let the image of me standing tall with that letter be the last thing they remembered when they thought of me. So, I slipped the letter back into its envelope, tucked it carefully into my jacket, and smiled. Not smug, not gloating, just steady. Grace, I realized, is the sharpest revenge of all. A shift in the room as I began to move toward the door. I felt the ripple in the room. Conversation slowed, heads turned. People who had ignored me for years now reached out to shake my hand. Relatives who had whispered behind my back now forced smiles, their voices clumsy with awkward praise. "You'll do great things," one said. "We're so proud of you," another chimed in. But their words no longer held power over me, because pride given too late doesn't sink in. It slides off, like water on glass. Still, I nodded, accepted their gestures, and moved on. Not for them, but for myself, because I no longer needed their approval. The brother's eyes, and then I saw him. My brother stood near the stage, his glass untouched, his smile stiff. For a moment our eyes met. He didn't speak. Neither did I. There was no need. He knew what had happened. He knew the balance had shifted, and though he was still Harvard's golden child, he would never again stand so far above me. He had been humbled, not by insult, not by cruelty, but by truth. I gave him the smallest nod, not of triumph, but of acknowledgement. A nod that said, "We are equals now." He looked away first. The parents' regret. My parents waited by the doorway, almost as if they knew I wouldn't stay long. Their faces carried the weight of 1,000 unsaid apologies. "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" My mother asked softly. I thought about answering. I thought about saying all the things that had burnt acknowledgement in me for years. The pain of being overlooked, the sting of their comparisons, the loneliness of invisibility. But I didn't, because they already knew. Deep down, they knew. So instead, I said the only thing that mattered. It doesn't matter anymore, and I meant it. I stepped through the doors and into the cool night air. The sound of the celebration dulled behind me, muffled by the heavy doors that closed with a soft thud. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel like the forgotten one, the overlooked sibling, or the disappointment. I felt free, free from their opinions, free from their whispers, free from the endless comparisons. The letter wasn't just paper, it was proof. Proof that I had carved my own path. Proof that I didn't need their permission to succeed. Proof that being overlooked doesn't mean being unworthy. As I walked into the night, I realized something profound. I didn't need this party. I didn't need their respect. I didn't need to stand in anyone's spotlight, because the truth had already set me free. And in that freedom, I found strength. They would remember tonight. They would talk about it for years. The party where the golden child's shadow cracked, where the forgotten one stepped into the light. But me? I would carry something else. Not their respect, not their regret, just the knowledge that I had never been less. I had always been enough. There was no marching band, no fireworks, no dramatic exit. Just me, walking into the quiet night with dignity. And that was victory enough. Because sometimes revenge isn't about tearing others down. Sometimes it's about standing tall, walking away, and knowing you've already won. And that night, as I left the hall behind me, I carried no bitterness. Only truth, only peace. And that was sweeter than any applause could ever be. When I look back on that night now, I realize something important. It was never about Harvard. It was never even about the envelope. It was about the years I spent trying to prove my worth to people who refused to see it. It was about the pain of being invisible in my own family, of hearing my name spoken only in comparison, never in pride. It was about carrying the weight of being the forgotten one until the truth finally forced its way into the light. And yet, the envelope didn't make me worthy. I was already worthy, long before anyone clapped for me, long before anyone whispered my name with respect. I had value. The only difference was this: they finally saw it. Being ignored doesn't mean being worthless. Here's the truth I learned that night, the one I want you to carry with you. Being ignored doesn't mean you're worthless. Being overlooked doesn't mean you're a failure. Being compared to someone else doesn't erase your light. It only means that some people can't see you yet, and sometimes that blindness has nothing to do with you and everything to do with them. For years, I thought silence meant failure. I thought their lack of attention proved I was less. But now I know better. Silence is not proof of weakness. It is only the quiet before the truth arrives. I didn't plan some elaborate revenge. I didn't plot. I didn't scream, and I didn't fight to be heard. All I did was wait, and in that waiting, I worked. I built myself in the shadows. I achieved it, not for applause, but for myself. And when the time came, when the truth finally surfaced, it was undeniable. Patience became my weapon. Dignity became my shield. And truth became the loudest voice in the room. There are many kinds of revenge in this world. Some are loud, dramatic, and fueled by anger. But the sweetest kind is the kind where you don't even have to lift a hand. The kind where your success speaks louder than your enemies ever could. The kind where your growth makes their words meaningless. The kind where you don't tear anyone down. You simply rise above. That night, I didn't need to insult anyone. I didn't need to gloat. I simply let the envelope speak. And in its silence, it shouted louder than I ever could. Here's what's funny about respect. When it's forced, it fades. But when it's earned, truly earned, it lingers forever. My family didn't respect me out of pity. They respected me because they had no choice. The truth demanded it. And though their recognition came late, I didn't need it to validate me anymore. Because real respect isn't about others finally clapping for you. It's about you standing tall, with or without the applause. So if you've ever been the overlooked one, the quiet one, the one they whisper about when they think you're not listening, hear me now. Your value does not shrink because others fail to see it. Your worth does not fade because someone else shines brighter. And your silence is not weakness. It is potential waiting for the right moment. Keep working. Keep building. Keep growing in the shadows. Because one day, your truth will surface. And when it does, no gossip, no dismissal, no comparison will be able to erase it. The greatest revenge isn't in shouting or proving others wrong. It's in carrying yourself with dignity, no matter how they treat you. When you walk with dignity, you don't chase respect. You attract it. When you hold your head high, you don't beg for recognition. You command it. And when you stay silent long enough, the truth always finds its way to the surface. I used to think being overlooked meant being less. Now, I see it differently. Being overlooked gave me space to grow without their eyes on me. Being overlooked gave me time to build quietly, without pressure. Being overlooked gave me the sweetest victory of all, to rise when no one expected it. So maybe being overlooked isn't a curse. Maybe it's a hidden gift. Because when the overlooked finally rise, they don't just shine, they burn, and no one forgets it. That night, I walked out with dignity, not bitter, not angry, not broken. I walked out free, and I hope you remember this. If you are ever overlooked, if you are ever ignored, if you are ever made to feel invisible, hold on, because your moment is coming. And when it does, let your truth speak, because truth, patience, and dignity are the most powerful revenge of all.